Before Johto became the region we know today, before Chikorita and Cyndaquil and Totodile became the beloved starters of countless trainers, there existed a completely different version of Generation 2. A demo shown quietly at an event called Space World in 1997 revealed creatures that would never make the journey into the final games. Some of these designs were reworked gently into Pokémon we recognize from later generations, while others vanished entirely, leaving only faint traces in leaked data files that surfaced more than 2 decades after that quiet autumn showcase. Tonight, we drift through the stories of these forgotten designs, exploring the alternate timeline where Generation 2 looked nothing like the version that would eventually rest on shelves in the year 2000, and the best place to start is where a small, hidden detail sits quietly in the development timeline, where Game Freak had already completed roughly 80% of a Pokemon game that would ultimately be set aside and rebuilt from the ground up into something entirely new. The demo that appeared at Space World 1997 was a restrictive glimpse into this alternate Generation 2. Players could only explore the starting town, wander through the first route, and reach the gate that would normally lead into the next town before the demo ended. Yet within the data of this limited build, 100 new Pokemon designs existed quietly, most with placeholder stats of 50 across the board. The Pokédex order felt unfinalized, with evolutionary families scattered strangely throughout the numbering system. Togepi appeared directly after Ho-Oh, creating an odd juxtaposition between a legendary bird and a small egg Pokémon. Every creature in this demo used a single solid color palette, much like Generation 1, because this version was being developed for the original Game Boy rather than the Game Boy Color that would eventually host the final release, and it leaves a quiet impression once you notice it. And before you drift off, maybe tap subscribe for more gentle videos, and let me know where you're listening from tonight. The color limitation tells its own story about the development process. Each Pokemon sprite displayed in shades of a single hue, whether green or blue or brown or red. The vibrant multicolored designs that would define Gold and Silver's visual identity simply did not exist yet in this earlier build. When development restarted and the target platform shifted to Game Boy Color, the entire aesthetic philosophy changed. Pokemon could suddenly express themselves through richer palettes, allowing for more nuanced designs and clearer visual storytelling. This technical shift influenced which designs survived the transition and which were left behind in the monochrome past. As we drift a little deeper tonight, the starter Pokemon of this beta version revealed just how different the journey through Johto might have been. Instead of Chikorita, players would have begun with a leaf-type creature called Happa. Instead of Cyndaquil, they would have received a fire bear named Honoguma. And instead of Totodile, the water starter was a peculiar design named Kurusu. These were not minor variations on familiar themes, but entirely different creatures with their own evolutionary paths. Happa's evolution line included a middle stage that looked nothing like Bayleaf, though interestingly, the final evolution was still Meganium, called Hanaryu in this earlier version. The concept of a dinosaur with a flower remained, but the journey to reach that form followed a completely different visual progression. Honoguma, the Fire Bear starter, presents one of the more curious cases in beta Pokemon history. This design never made it past the Space World demo, yet its concept of a fire-type bear would eventually resurface in later generations. Some fans see echoes of Honoguma in Teddiursa and Ursaring from the final Generation 2, though those became normal-type Pokemon rather than fire specialists. Others point to Torkoal from Generation 3, or even Emboar from Generation 5, as spiritual successors to the Fire Bear concept. The design itself showed a round, friendly bear with flames incorporated into its body, establishing a template that Game Freak would revisit in different forms across multiple generations. Kurusu, the water starter, remains somewhat mysterious because less information survived about its evolutionary line compared to the other two starters. What we do know is that it looked distinctly different from Totodile's crocodilian design. The name itself does not provide clear clues about what animal or concept it was based on, unlike how Hanaguma clearly referenced a bear or how Happa suggested a leaf. This ambiguity has led to various fan theories about what Kurusu might have evolved into and why it was ultimately replaced with the more straightforward crocodile concept that became Totodile's line. The decision to completely replace all three starter designs between the demo and the final release was significant. Starter Pokémon form the emotional core of each generation's identity. They are the first meaningful choice players make, the companions who travel through the entire journey, and often the most merchandised and remembered creatures from their respective games. Scrapping us all three and starting fresh required tremendous confidence that the new designs would better serve the final vision for gold and silver. History suggests this was the right call, as Chikorita, Cyndaquil, and Totodile became beloved characters in their own right, but it is worth wondering what the alternate timeline would have looked like, where Happa and Hanaguma and Kurusu were the faces of Generation 2. Slowly, the story widens beyond the starter Pokémon to encompass entirely original evolutionary lines that never made it into any generation. One of the most complete cut families was a water and steel type line consisting of 3 stages. The first form was called Manbo, a simple water type that would evolve into Ikari, gaining the steel typing at that stage. The final form was named Guratesu, a fully realized water and steel creature that looked distinctly different from anything in the final Pokédex. What makes this line particularly interesting is that each stage appears to have influenced different Pokémon in later generations. Monbo's design and name bear striking resemblance to Alamomola from Generation 5, even sharing similar Japanese naming conventions. Ikari's sharp, aggressive appearance seems to have inspired Sharpedo from Generation 3, and Guratesu's elongated body and steel plating suggest a connection to Huntail, also from Generation 3. This pattern of broken evolutionary lines being redistributed across different generations and different type combinations appears throughout the beta designs. Game Freak rarely let good ideas vanish completely. Instead, they would extract elements from cut Pokémon and recombine them into new creatures years later. Sometimes, an entire design would be revived with minor modifications. Other times, only a specific visual motif or conceptual approach would be carried forward into a completely different species. This evolutionary approach to game design meant that nothing was ever truly wasted, just temporarily set aside until the right context emerged. Another fascinating cut line was a pair of dark-type cat Pokémon called Rinjin and Beering. Both designs featured bells incorporated into their bodies, suggesting a connection to Japanese folklore about Bakaneko or other supernatural cat yokai. Dark type was brand new in Generation 2, having been introduced specifically to add more strategic depth to the type chart and to give players new tools for combating the previously dominant Psychic type. Many of the beta Dark type designs leaned heavily into yokai and ghost story imagery, creating a distinct aesthetic that the final generation only partially preserved through Pokémon like Umbreon, Murkrow, and Houndour. Rinjin and Beering's designs showed cats with bells hanging from various parts of their bodies, possibly as collars or as integrated anatomical features. In Japanese folklore, The sound of a bell was often associated with warding off evil spirits, or conversely, with supernatural beings announcing their presence. The ambiguity of whether these bell carrying cats were protectors or threats themselves created an interesting tension in the design. Their exclusion from the final game might have been due to tonal concerns, as Generation 2 generally aimed for a lighter atmosphere than Generation 1's occasionally eerie moments, or it might have simply been a matter of too many cat Pokémon already existing in the combined Kanto and Johto Pokédex. There's a quiet comfort in remembering moments like these, where even abandoned ideas contribute to our understanding of how beloved games came together. The Ice-type designs from the beta build included two Pokémon named Urufuon and Urufu, both wearing wolf-like coats as disguises. This concept of a Pokémon hiding inside a costume or using mimicry as its primary design element would not fully manifest until Mimikyu appeared in Generation 7. Urufuon and Urufu presented the idea much earlier, showing that Game Freak had been experimenting with the concept of Pokémon who wear disguises or transform their appearance through clothing or props for many years before finally implementing it successfully. The specific choice of wolf coats for these ice-type Pokémon connects to several layers of folklore and natural history that make the design particularly rich. In cold climates throughout history, humans have worn animal pelts for warmth and protection, and wolves have been both feared predators and respected for their survival abilities in harsh environments. The image of a creature wearing a wolf's skin invokes the classic fable of a wolf in sheep's clothing, but inverted, a sheep or other prey animal wearing a wolf's pelt for protection or camouflage. This narrative inversion creates an immediate intrigue and raises questions about the Pokemon's true nature underneath the disguise. The dual nature of these designs, both the creature itself and the coat it wears, would have created interesting opportunities for gameplay mechanics. Would the wolf coat provide defensive bonuses or special abilities? Would it change the Pokemon's appearance in battle or only in the overworld? Could the coat be removed or changed, similar to how Rotom can change forms or how Deoxys has multiple forms? These mechanical questions probably contributed to the designs being cut, as implementing the disguise concept properly would have required new systems and code that might not have been feasible within Generation 2's development constraints. The idea was ahead of its time, waiting for the technology and design systems to catch up before it could be properly realized. The cultural folklore surrounding wolves in Japanese tradition also adds depth to understanding these designs. Wolves hold a complex position in Japanese mythology, sometimes appearing as divine messengers or protective spirits, other times as dangerous predators. The extinction of the Japanese wolf in the early 20th century has given the animal a melancholic, nostalgic quality in modern Japanese culture. A Pokemon wearing a wolf coat could tap into these layered associations, representing both the power and the loss of wolves, the desire to embody their strength while acknowledging their absence from the natural world. These themes align well with Pokemon's broader interest in exploring humanity's relationship with nature and animals. The ice typing of Urufuon and Urufu also deserves consideration in understanding why these designs were conceived and why they were ultimately cut. Ice type. Pokemon have consistently been among the rarest in every generation's regional Pokedex, partly because ice environments are geographically limited, and partly because ice is one of the more specialized types with significant weaknesses. Creating compelling ice-type designs that feel distinct from previous ice Pokemon while also being appealing enough to encourage players to use them despite the type's disadvantages is a persistent challenge. The Wolfcoat Pokemon attempted to address this by combining the ice typing with an interesting narrative hook to disguise an element that would make them memorable beyond just being ice creatures. Their removal might indicate that Game Freak felt the concept was too complex, or that other ice-type designs better served the Johto Pokédex's needs. Looking at the final Generation 2 roster, the ice-type representation includes Sneasel, Piloswine, and Delibird as the new species, with Sneasel being dark or ice, and Piloswine being ice or ground. Both of these dual-type combinations provide better defensive profiles than pure ice typing, suggesting that Game Freak was conscious of the type's vulnerabilities and was trying to mitigate them through strategic dual typing. Pure ice type. Pokemon, like the Wolfcoat designs, would have been more difficult to balance and might have felt less viable in competitive play. This practical concern about playability and type effectiveness probably factored into the decision to cut Urufuon and Urufu in favor of dual-type alternatives that offered more strategic flexibility. The aesthetic of the Wolfcoat design also represents a specific approach to creature design that Game Freak has returned to periodically but sparingly. Pokemon that wear clothes or accessories, like Farfetch'd with its leek or Timber with its wooden beam, walk a fine line between feeling like natural creatures and feeling too anthropomorphized or artificial. The Wolfcoat Pokemon would have been explicitly wearing something that was not part of their body, which could have made them feel less like wild creatures and more like dressed-up characters. This aesthetic concern might have contributed to their removal, as Game Freak refined their understanding of how much human-like clothing or tool use they wanted to incorporate into Pokemon designs while maintaining the creature's fundamental animal nature. The Wolfcoat design suggested these Pokemon might have been based on sheep in wolf's clothing, inverting the classic fable, or perhaps they were intended to be actual wolves who wore the pelts of other creatures for warmth or camouflage. The ice typing implies they lived in cold environments where such disguises would be practical. Their exclusion from Generation 2 left a gap that other ice-type Pokemon could not quite fill, as none of the final designs played with the costume or mimicry concept in the same way. Sneasel came closest, with its punk aesthetic, suggesting a deliberate style choice, but it lacked the narrative weight of a Pokemon literally wearing another creature's appearance. Before we continue this gentle journey, it is worth pausing to consider how many of these cut Pokemon represent design philosophies that were ahead of their time. Game Freak's designers were exploring concepts that the technology and cartridge space of the Game Boy Color could not fully support. Ideas that required more sophisticated sprite work, more complex animations, or more storage space for additional data had to be simplified or removed entirely. This technical limitation shaped which designs survived and which were left behind, but it did not diminish the creativity and ambition present in those early sketches and concepts. The return of Kotora and Raitora in the Generation 2 beta provides a unique case study in how Game Freak revisited old ideas. These electric tiger Pokemon had been cut from Generation 1's development, but were reconsidered during the creation of Gold and Silver. In the Space World demo, they appeared without the third evolution that had been planned for Generation 1, suggesting that Game Freak was streamlining the concept while giving it a second chance. However, even this simplified version did not make the final cut. These tigers were rejected twice, once for the original games, and again for the sequel, indicating that something about the design or concept fundamentally did not align with the developer's vision for the Pokemon world. Why would Game Freak bring back a previously cut design only to remove it again? Perhaps they hoped that the extra development time and the lessons learned from completing Generation 1 would reveal how to make the electric tiger work within the game's balance and aesthetic. Perhaps they simply loved the concept and wanted to give it every possible chance to succeed. Or perhaps the decision was purely practical. Preserving the design in their files made it easy to quickly implement when they needed to fill out the Pokédex, and removing it again was equally straightforward when space became tight and priorities shifted. Whatever the reason, Kotora and Retora represent the only Pokémon from the Generation 1 beta that we know were explicitly reconsidered and rejected a second time. As we drift a little deeper tonight, the ghost-type designs from the beta reveal some of the darker concepts Game Freak was willing to explore before deciding they were too unsettling for the final game. Two Pokémon named Norara and Chopin took the move. Curse and made it literal. Their designs showed creatures with needles or pins stuck into their bodies, invoking imagery of cursed dolls and voodoo effigies. Curse was already a somewhat dark move in the final game, with ghost-type Pokémon sacrificing their own hit points to place a damaging curse on their opponent. But these beta designs took the concept further, showing Pokémon that embodied the curse through their physical appearance, making the self-harm aspect of the move visually explicit. The decision to cut Norara and Chopin likely came down to concerns about the appropriateness of showing creatures in constant pain or engaged in self-harm, even in a fictional monster-collecting game. Generation 2 was designed to appeal to a young audience, and while the Pokémon series has never shied away from darker themes in its Pokédex entries and occasional plot points, there is a difference between text descriptions that hint at unsettling concepts and sprite work that explicitly depicts disturbing imagery. Norara and Chopin crossed that line, making their exclusion understandable even if it meant losing unique and memorable designs. Another extraordinarily unique cut Pokémon was Bamoshika, a creature that combined water and fire typing in a single form. This would not occur in the actual games until Volcanion appeared in Generation 6, making Bamoshika ahead of its time by 4 full generations. The concept of a Pokémon that simultaneously embodied 2 opposing elements had tremendous potential for interesting gameplay mechanics and narrative significance. How could a creature be both water and fire? What kind of physiology would allow such a combination to exist? The answers to these questions would have made Bamoshika one of the most discussed Pokémon in Generation 2's Pokédex. The design itself remains somewhat mysterious because only limited sprite information survived. What we know suggests Bamoshika might have been based on a hot spring or geothermal vent, natural phenomena where water and fire coexist through volcanic activity. This would have given the Pokémon a strong connection to the themes of balance and natural power that run throughout the Pokémon series. Its absence from the final game represents one of the more significant missed opportunities, as its unique typing would have added considerable strategic depth to competitive battling and would have raised intriguing questions about the lore and biology of the Pokémon world. There are moments in development history where a single design tells a complete story on its own, and Turban represents one of those moments. This Pokémon was clearly designed as the shell that Slowpoke evolves from when it becomes Slowbro or Slowking. In the original games, the shelter that bites Slowpoke's tail or head triggers the evolution, but the resulting shell looks nothing like Shelter's normal appearance. Turban would have solved this narrative and inconsistency by establishing that the shell was its own species, separate from the Shelter evolutionary line entirely. When a Turban attached itself to a Slowpoke, both creatures would transform, creating one of the Slowpoke evolutions. The name Turban references the turban-like shape that appears on Slowking's head, though the design would also account for the tail shell seen on Slowbro. This dual purpose made Turban an elegant solution to a long-standing oddity in Pokémon biology. However, its exclusion from the final game was probably inevitable. Adding Turban would have required explaining why it exists independently, where players could encounter it, and how the evolution mechanic would work in practice. The resulting complexity might have confused players or created unexpected balance issues if Turban could also be used in battle on its own. Sometimes the cleanest solution is to leave certain mysteries unexplained, and the ambiguity around Slowbro and Slowking's shells has become part of their charm. Slowly, the story widens to encompass the many baby Pokémon that were planned for Generation 2 but never implemented. Game Freak had initially designed 17 different baby Pokémon, likely planning to add pre-evolutions to many of the original 151 species. This would have given players more complete evolutionary lines and created new breeding mechanics centered around raising these baby forms. However, only 7 baby Pokémon made it into the final game, including Pichu, Cleffa, Igglybuff, Togepi, Tyrogue, Smoochum, Elekid, and Magby. The other 10 baby designs were cut, representing a significant reduction in Game Freak's original vision for how breeding and baby Pokémon would function in Generation 2. Among the cut baby Pokémon was a pre-evolution for Growlithe called Pi, whose name translates to Petite Growlithe. This fire type would have evolved into Growlithe at level 13, creating a 3-stage evolutionary line for the beloved dog Pokémon. Another cut baby was a pre-evolution for Grimer, simply named Grimer Baby in the data files. It would have been a pure poison type, evolving into Grimer at level 19. These designs were straightforward, adding logical starting points to evolutionary families that previously began at what seemed like middle stages of development. Their removal probably came down to space constraints and the realization that 17 baby Pokémon would overwhelm the breeding system and make Generation 2's Pokédex feel too focused on pre-evolutions rather than on exciting new, fully evolved species. The breeding mechanics that were being developed alongside these baby Pokémon reveal another layer of complexity in Generation 2's creation process. The beta version included early implementations of breeding systems that would allow players to hatch eggs containing these baby forms. The incense items that would later become essential for breeding certain baby Pokémon in Generation 4 might have had their conceptual origins in this earlier beta system. Game Freak was clearly thinking several generations ahead, planting seeds of her mechanics that would not fully blossom until much later in the series' history. The decision to cut so many baby Pokémon from Generation 2 might have actually helped preserve the viability of breeding as a long-term feature, as it left room for future generations to add new baby forms without making the mechanic feel exhausted or overused too early. The way baby Pokémon were distributed across different evolutionary families also reveals strategic thinking about which existing species most needed pre-evolutions. Some Pokémon from Generation 1 felt incomplete without baby forms, like how Jinx seemed to emerge fully formed without any logical starting point. The addition of Smoochum in the final Generation 2 helped address this by providing a cute, less intimidating starting stage for the Jinx line. Other Generation 1 Pokémon were given pre-evolutions to create interesting new, strategic options, like how Tyrogue branches into 3 different final forms based on its stats, introducing a novel evolution mechanic. The beta baby Pokémon that were cut likely failed to add sufficient strategic interest or narrative completeness to justify their inclusion when space and development resources were limited. Looking at the specific cut baby designs more closely, each one tells a story about what Game Freak was trying to accomplish with pre-evolutions. The baby Meowth, Koninya represented an attempt to make the Meowth line feel more complete and to potentially add breeding depth to a Pokemon that was prominently featured in the anime through Team Rocket's Meowth character. However, Meowth already had a strong identity as a street-smart, somewhat scrappy cat Pokemon, and adding an even cuter baby form might have undermined that characterization. Sometimes a Pokemon is better served by being presented as already formed rather than by showing its infantile origins. The Baby Grimer design, informally called Grimer Baby by fans who study beta content, presents interesting questions about how baby forms should relate visually to their evolutions. Grimer is already a fairly simple, amorphous poison sludge creature. What would a baby version look like? Would it be a smaller pile of sludge? Would it have different features that made it appear more infantile? The challenge of designing a baby form that is both visually distinct from and clearly connected to its evolution probably contributed to this design's removal. When the design task becomes too difficult or the result is not sufficiently interesting, cutting the content becomes the right choice, even if it means abandoning work that has already been invested. The Baby Doduo represents perhaps the most instructively flawed of all the cut baby designs. Evolution in Pokemon generally follows logical progressions, where features are added, enhanced, or modified in ways that make biological or fantastical sense. A baby with 3 heads evolving into a juvenile with 2 heads violates this logic so completely that it raises immediate questions about what happened to the missing head. Did it fall off? Did 2 of the 3 heads merge? The design was charming in isolation, showing a bird's nest with 3 chicks, but it failed the basic test of evolutionary coherence. This failure probably taught Game Freak to be more careful about maintaining consistent anatomical features across evolutionary stages, a lesson that has generally been followed in subsequent generations, with rare exceptions. The most peculiar cut baby Pokemon was likely the pre-evolution for Doduo, a creature that somehow had 3 heads despite evolving into Doduo, which only has 2 heads. This evolutionary inconsistency was so glaring that it likely contributed directly to the design's removal. Pokemon evolutions typically follow logical progressions, with features being added or enhanced as the creature grows stronger. A 3-headed baby devolving into a 2-headed juvenile before re-evolving into a 3-headed adult makes no biological or visual sense. The design was based on a bird's nest, which was a charming concept, but the head count problem was insurmountable without completely rethinking Doduo's appearance or abandoning the baby Pokemon concept entirely. Another baby Pokemon that appeared in the beta but did not make the final cut was a pre-evolution for Meowth called Koninya, meaning coin meow. This design appeared in both the Generation 1 beta materials and again in the Generation 2 demo, making it one of the few baby Pokemon concepts that Game Freak attempted to implement twice before ultimately deciding against it. The design was undeniably cute, possibly even cuter than Meowth itself, which might have been part of the problem. When a pre-evolution is more appealing than the form it evolves into, players might feel disappointed when their cute baby monster grows up into something less charming. This phenomenon likely influenced several of the baby Pokemon cuts, as Game Freak realized that not every evolutionary line benefited from having an additional early stage. The persistence of Koninya across 2 generations of development suggests that someone at Game Freak was particularly fond of this design and kept advocating for its inclusion. Perhaps the original artist who created Meowth wanted to expand on that concept by showing its infantile form. Perhaps the anime's popularity of Team Rocket's Meowth made the developers think that adding a baby form would generate merchandise opportunities and fan enthusiasm. Whatever the internal discussions were, they ultimately concluded twice that Konya should not be included, suggesting that the arguments against it were consistently more persuasive than the arguments in favor. This repeated rejection across multiple development cycles demonstrates a consistency of vision about what did and did not belong in the Pokémon world. Before we move deeper into other categories of cut designs, there is one particularly unique evolution from the beta that deserves extensive examination: Animon, the supposed evolution of Ditto. This design represents one of the boldest concepts in the entire beta Pokédex because it would have fundamentally changed how players understood and used one of Generation 1's most unusual Pokémon. Ditto's entire identity revolves around its transform ability, which allows it to perfectly copy any opponent it faces. The prospect of evolving Ditto raised immediate questions about whether that transformation ability would be preserved, enhanced, or replaced entirely in the evolved form. In the beta data, Animon is categorized as a normal-type Pokémon, which initially seems to make sense given that Ditto is also normal-type. However, the evolution method programmed into the demo specified that Ditto would evolve into Animon when traded while holding a metal coat, the same item that causes Onyx to evolve into Steelix and Scyther to evolve into Scizor. This evolution method strongly implies that Animon was actually intended to be a Steel-type Pokémon, with the normal-type classification in the data being either a placeholder or an error that would have been corrected before any hypothetical release. The possibility of a Steel-type evolution for Ditto is fascinating because it would have given Ditto players a choice: keep Ditto for its unique transformation ability, or evolve it into Animon for presumably better base stats and the defensive benefits of Steel typing. The name Animon itself provides some clues about the concept behind this design. In Japanese, Animon could be interpreted as a play on animation or transformation, continuing the theme of change and copying that defines Ditto's character. Alternatively, it might reference the transformation capabilities of certain materials, or the idea of a malleable form becoming more solid and defined, which would align with the thematic shift from normal to Steel typing. The visual design of Animon, based on the limited sprite data available, shows a creature that appears more defined and solid than Ditto's amorphous blob shape, supporting the interpretation that evolution would represent a transition from formless adaptation to structured strength. The gameplay implications of an evolved Ditto would have been profound and potentially problematic. If Animon retained the transform ability while gaining the Steel typing, it would have become an extraordinarily versatile Pokémon capable of copying any opponent while enjoying Steel's excellent defensive type matchups. This could have made Animon overpowered in competitive battling, able to counter almost any threat by transforming into it while maintaining Steel's resistances. If Animon did not retain Transform and instead gained a normal move pool, it would have felt disconnected from its pre-evolution, raising questions about why anyone would evolve their Ditto and lose access to its signature ability. Either approach presented significant balance and design challenges. The decision to cut Animon probably came down to these unresolvable gameplay tensions. Transform is such a unique and defining ability that it is difficult to imagine a Ditto evolution that either preserves it without becoming overpowered or abandons it without feeling like a betrayal of the Pokémon's identity. Game Freak likely experimented with various approaches during development, testing different stat distributions, move pools, and ability interactions, before ultimately concluding that no version of Animon could work satisfactorily within the game's balance framework. Sometimes the most interesting concepts are also the most difficult to implement well, and cutting them becomes necessary even though it means losing something potentially special. The cultural context around transformation and change also plays into understanding why Animon might have been conceptualized in the first place. Japanese folklore is rich with stories of creatures that can change their shape, from tanuki and kitsune, who take human form, to supernatural beings who disguise themselves to trick or assist humans. Ditto already taps into this transformation mythology through its transform ability, and Animon would have extended that theme by showing that transformation itself could evolve and become more sophisticated. The shift from normal to steel typing could have represented a philosophical journey from chaotic change to structured adaptation, from copying anything indiscriminately to selective strategic transformation. These thematic layers make Animon one of the most conceptually rich cut designs, even if practical considerations prevented its implementation. Years later, some fans have theorized that Melton and Melmetal from Generation 7 might be spiritual successors to the Animon concept. Both are steel-type Pokémon with unusual properties. Both have connections to transformation and change through their unique evolution mechanic in Pokémon Go, and both occupy unusual niches in the Pokédex as rare special cases. Whether Game Freak consciously drew on the Animon concept when creating Melton is unknown and probably unknowable without direct confirmation from the developers, but the parallels are intriguing enough to suggest that the idea of a small, mysterious steel type with transformation themes has remained appealing to the design team across multiple generations. Before we move deeper into the more obscure beta designs, it is worth reflecting on how these cut baby Pokémon shape the final direction of Generation 2. By reducing the number of baby Pokémon from 17 to 7, Game Freak ensured that each baby form that did make it into the game felt special and significant. Pichu became iconic as the baby form of Pokémon's mascot. Togepi became a major character in the anime. Tyrogue introduced the concept of branching evolutions based on stats. If all 17 baby designs had been included, none of them would have received the same level of attention and development. Sometimes creative decisions are about focus, concentrating resources on a smaller number of stronger ideas rather than spreading effort across a larger collection of weaker concepts. As we drift a little deeper tonight, the evolutionary lines that were radically altered between the demo and the final release reveal Game Freak's evolving design philosophy. Girafarig, for example, looked completely different in the beta version, and it originally had a baby form called Sunu. The beta Girafarig was more exaggerated and cartoonish compared to the sleek, palindrome-based design that eventually appeared in gold and silver. Sunu looked like a tiny, adorable version of this original Girafarig concept, with oversized features emphasizing its status as a baby creature. The entire line was reconceptualized at some point during development, resulting in the Girafarig we know today, a Pokémon whose design is based on being symmetrical and palindromic, and Sunu vanished entirely because it no longer fit with the new direction. The redesign of Girafarig suggests that Game Freak was still actively experimenting with visual styles and design approaches well into Generation 2's development. Some Pokémon that existed in the Space World demo were not simply cut, but were rebuilt from the ground up, maintaining only their basic concept while changing everything about their appearance, and sometimes even their typing or stats. This fluidity in the design process meant that nothing was truly final until the game went to production, and even well-developed designs with multiple evolutionary stages could be completely rethought if the developers felt the concept was not reaching its full potential. Another example of a radically altered evolutionary line involves the various forms of Unknown. In the beta, Unknown had 26 forms corresponding to each letter of the English alphabet, the same as in the final game. However, The designs of these forms were quite different, with some letters being more abstract or stylized compared to the cleaner, more uniform appearance they would eventually receive. The programming for Unown was also still being worked out, as the demo did not fully implement the mechanism for randomly determining which form would appear when encountered. This technical challenge likely contributed to Unown's delayed implementation, as creating a Pokémon with multiple forms required new code systems that had not existed in Generation 1. The conceptual origins of Unown reach back to ancient writing systems and the idea that written language itself holds mysterious power. The ruins of Alph in the final Gold and Silver games present Unown as living hieroglyphs, creatures that exist at the intersection of language, history, and mystery. The beta versions of these letter forms were more ornate and decorative, with additional flourishes and stylistic elements that made them feel more like ancient inscriptions or religious symbols. The simplification process that occurred between the beta and final release stripped away these elaborate details in favor of cleaner, more immediately readable designs. This change served practical purposes, making it easier for players to quickly identify which letter they had encountered, but it also altered the aesthetic somewhat, making Unown feel less like mystical ancient symbols and more like basic alphabet letters with eyes. The technical implementation of Unown's multiple forms represents a significant innovation in Pokémon programming that would have far-reaching consequences for future games. Before Unown, every Pokémon had exactly one appearance, with the only variations being gender-based differences that were not yet implemented in Generation 1. Creating a system where a single Pokémon species could have 26 distinct appearances required new data structures and new ways of handling sprite loading, stat checking, and Pokédex entries. The beta version's incomplete implementation suggests that these systems were still being debugged and refined during the Space World demo period. The decision to include Unown despite these technical challenges, while cutting other Pokémon that were more straightforward to implement, reveals something about Game Freak's priorities. Unown was not a powerful Pokémon competitively, learning only the move Hidden Power and having mediocre stats. Its value was entirely atmospheric and collectible, providing a sense of mystery and giving players a reason to explore the ruins of Alph thoroughly. Game Freak apparently felt that this atmospheric contribution was worth the technical investment required to implement the multiple form system. This suggests that the developers understood that not every Pokémon needs to be competitively viable, that some can exist purely to enhance the world building and to give certain areas of the game a unique identity. The ruins of Alph themselves were probably designed in conjunction with Unown, with the entire area serving as a showcase for this unusual Pokémon and its connection to ancient mysteries. The puzzle-solving elements, the hidden chambers, the archaeological themes, all of these design choices created a context where Unown's existence made sense and felt meaningful. Without that environmental storytelling, Unown might have felt random or out of place, just another strange creature in a world full of strange creatures. But situated within the ruins, accompanied by puzzle mechanics and lore about ancient civilizations, Unown became something more, a living piece of the world's history, a creature that blurred the line between Pokémon and written language. This integration of Pokémon design with environmental design represents a sophistication in game development that would become increasingly prominent in later generations. The comparison between Beta Unown and Final Unown also highlights the importance of visual clarity in creature design. The more ornate beta forms might have been aesthetically beautiful, with their additional flourishes and decorative elements creating intricate symbol-like appearances. However, this complexity could have made them harder to distinguish quickly, especially on the small screen of a Game Boy Color. When a player encountered an unknown, they needed to be able to identify which letter it represented quickly and clearly. The simplification process that produced the final designs prioritized this functional requirement over pure aesthetic elaboration. This is a common pattern in game design, where initial concepts are often more complex and detailed than final implementations, with the refinement process stripping away the elements that interfere with clarity and usability. The cultural significance of writing and ancient scripts in the Pokémon world is also worth considering. Throughout the series, ancient texts, mysterious inscriptions, and lost languages have played important narrative roles, from the tablets in Sinnoh that tell the creation myth to the ancient writings in ruins throughout various regions. Unknown represents the first attempt to make these linguistic mysteries into living creatures, to suggest that language itself might have existed in Pokémon form in ancient times. This concept is philosophically rich, raising questions about the relationship between communication, consciousness, and creature existence. Were Unknown created by ancient humans who wanted to give their writing physical form, or did ancient humans base their writing systems on Unknown that already existed? The games leave these questions deliberately ambiguous, allowing players to form their own interpretations. There's a quiet comfort in remembering moments like these, where technical limitations and creative ambitions intersected to produce interesting compromises. Unknown's final design simplified certain visual elements to make the multiple forms easier to render and distinguish, ensuring that players could actually tell which letter they had caught without needing to carefully study each one. This balance between artistic vision and practical implementation appears throughout the beta designs, as Game Freak learned which ideas could be realized with the available technology and which needed to be saved for future hardware generations. The legendary Pokémon of the beta build also underwent significant changes, though some of the details remain unclear because the demo only contained partial data for these creatures. Ho-Oh appeared in the Space World demo, though its color palette was different, using a single gold tone rather than the rich multicolor scheme it would eventually receive on the Game Boy Color. The beta also included a mysterious Pokémon numbered close to Ho-Oh that might have been an early concept for Lugia, or possibly an entirely different legendary that was replaced. Lugia's creation story is well documented, having been designed specifically for the second Pokémon movie and then retroactively added to the games. Before Lugia existed, something else was planned as the counterpart to Ho-Oh, and that creature's identity remains one of the more intriguing mysteries surrounding Generation 2's development. The timeline of legendary Pokémon development for Generation 2 is complex and involves the intersection of game development with anime and movie production. When the Space World demo was shown in 1997, the second Pokémon movie had not yet been produced, and Lugia did not exist in any form. The beta legendary that appears in the demo files as Pokémon number 349 represents what Game Freak had originally planned as the box art mascot for Pokémon Silver, before external media projects changed those plans. Understanding this legendary requires understanding the broader context of how Pokémon was evolving from a game franchise into a multimedia empire, and how that evolution created pressures and opportunities that affected game development in unexpected ways. The design of this proto-legendary, based on the sprite data available from the beta, shows a serpentine or plesiosaur-like creature with aquatic features and possible draconic elements. Its body appears elongated and flowing, suggesting graceful movement through water. The head design includes what might be fins or crests, giving it a regal appearance befitting a legendary Pokémon. The overall aesthetic suggests a guardian of the seas or a divine creature associated with water and perhaps weather, themes that would eventually be transferred to Lugia when that Pokemon was created for the movie and subsequently added to the games. The visual language of the proto-legendary speaks to ancient ocean mythology, to creatures like Leviathan or the Loch Ness Monster, to humanity's long fascination with what might dwell in the unexplored depths. The connection between this proto-legendary and Viking longships has been debated extensively in fan communities studying the beta materials. Some elements of the design, particularly certain angular features and possibly decorative elements, have been interpreted as resembling the prow decorations that Viking ships featured, often carved into dragon or serpent heads. Viking ships were themselves considered almost living beings by their builders and sailors, given names and treated with reverence and superstition. A Pokemon that combined the imagery of a sea serpent with the iconography of Viking longships would have been a powerful synthesis of natural and human mythology, suggesting a creature that had inspired human ship designs or that humans had created legends about after encountering it in ancient seas. The decision to replace this carefully designed proto-legendary with Lugia, a character created for the movie, represents a pivotal moment in Pokemon's history where the needs of the multimedia franchise overrode the original plans of the game development team. This is not necessarily a negative judgment. Lugia's design by Takeshi Shudo and artist Ken Sugimori for the movie resulted in an iconic Pokemon that has become one of the most recognizable and beloved legendaries in the entire series. However, it does mean that a complete legendary concept, one that had been developed specifically for the games with Generation 2's themes and story in mind, was discarded to make room for a character designed to serve the narrative needs of a film. The games adapted to accommodate the movie's creation rather than vice versa. What would Generation 2 have been like with the proto-legendary instead of Lugia? The thematic pairing with Ho-Oh would have been different, perhaps more focused on elemental opposites, fire and water, sky and sea, rather than the guardian roles that Ho-Oh and Lugia eventually occupied. The lore surrounding the Brass Tower and Tin Tower, the stories of the legendary beasts, the entire mythological framework of Johto might have been structured differently to accommodate a different sea legendary. The proto-legendary's connection to Viking imagery might have introduced Norse mythological elements into Pokemon's predominantly Japanese-inspired legendary pantheon, creating interesting cultural synthesis. These alternate possibilities exist only in speculation, but they remind us that every creative choice forecloses other potential paths, and even seemingly inevitable elements of beloved games might have been radically different under slightly altered circumstances. The relationship between the Pokemon games and the anime has always been complex and mutually influential, but Lugia's insertion into Generation 2 represents one of the most direct examples of the anime affecting game content. In later generations, this cross-pollination would become more common and more intentional, with Pokemon like Lucario, Zoroark, and others being designed specifically for promotional movies and then featured prominently in their respective games. Generation 2 was a transitional moment when these multimedia strategies were still being developed and refined. The proto-legendary's replacement by Lugia was probably unexpected and required scrambling to integrate the movie's legendary into a game that was already substantially developed. This integration was handled smoothly enough that most players never realized Lugia was a late addition, but the beta materials reveal the seams in that process and show us what was lost to make room for what we gained. The mechanical differences between what the proto-legendary might have been and what Lugia became are also worth considering. Lugia was given the psychic/flying typing, making it one of the few legendary Pokémon at the time with a dual type combination that was not dragon related. The proto-legendary, based on its aquatic appearance, was likely intended to be water type, possibly water flying or pure water. This typing would have created a clearer elemental opposition with Ho-Oh's fire flying typing, the sea versus the sky, water dousing fire. Lugia's psychic flying typing creates a different dynamic, both legendaries sharing the flying type, while their other types, psychic and fire, don't have a direct oppositional relationship. This change in typing affected how the legendaries were balanced, what strategies they enabled, and how they were positioned within the game's ecology of types and resistances. The stat distributions and signature moves of the proto-legendary remain unknown because that data either was not finalized in the beta or has not been accessible in the leaked materials. However, we can make educated guesses based on the design and intended role. As a box legendary meant to counterbalance Ho-Oh, it would have needed high base stat totals, probably in the 600 range, that defines most box legendaries. Its physical appearance suggests it might have been more defensively oriented than Ho-Oh, which learns the powerful sacred fire and has more offensive stats. A defensive sea legendary with high HP and special defense would have created an interesting strategic contrast with Ho-Oh's offensive fire and flying approach. The signature move might have been related to ocean storms, tidal waves, or the crushing pressure of deep water, thematically appropriate for a guardian of the seas. Some fan theories suggest that the proto-legendary might have had a connection to the legendary beasts, Raikou, Entei, and Suicune, paralleling how Lugia eventually became associated with the legendary birds, Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres. In the final games, Ho-Oh is strongly connected to the beasts through the lore of the Brass Tower, where Ho-Oh revived 3 Pokémon who died in the fire and transformed them into Raikou, Entei, and Suicune. If the proto-legendary was meant to be Ho-Oh's counterpart, it might have had a similar relationship with a trio of lesser legendaries, perhaps a trio that was cut or that became the beasts themselves before the lore was revised. The asymmetry in the final game, where Ho-Oh is tied to the beasts, but Lugia is tied to the Generation 1 birds instead, hints at narrative structures that were changed during development. The emotional impact of discovering the proto-legendary through beta leaks is substantial for longtime fans of Generation 2. For over 20 years, players experienced gold and silver with Lugia as the natural and inevitable legendary mascot for Silver version. Learning that another legendary was originally planned and seeing its design creates a sense of alternate history, a glimpse into a parallel universe where players received a different game with different iconic creatures. This revelation does not diminish Lugia's role or popularity, but it adds layers of complexity to understanding how Generation 2 came together. It shows that even elements that feel essential and permanent were contingent choices made under specific circumstances, and that the game we love could have been meaningfully different while potentially being equally beloved in those different forms. Some fans have theorized that a cut design, known informally as Pokémon number 349, might have been this proto-Lugia. The design appears to be based on a plesiosaur or sea serpent, with elements that could connect it to Viking longships or other nautical mythology. Its placement in the Pokédex near Ho-Oh suggests it was meant to be legendary, and its water-based appearance would have provided a thematic contrast to Ho-Oh's fire and flying associations. However, without official confirmation, all theories about this creature's intended role remain speculative. What we do know is that Lugia's late addition to the project required shuffling other designs around and possibly cutting or repurposing the original legendary water Pokémon that had been planned. Another mysterious cut Pokémon is a large boat or ship design numbered as 344 in the beta files. This creature combined elements of both a plesiosaur and a Viking longship, creating an unusual hybrid between organic and mechanical aesthetics. Some fans believe this was another legendary candidate, while others think it might have been a regular Pokémon with a unique gimmick or a potential evolution for Lapras. The ship design could have represented the concept of a Pokémon that humans could ride across water, similar to how Lapras functioned in the final games. If this is true, then the boat Pokémon might have been cut as redundant once Game Freak decided to keep Lapras available in Generation 2's Pokédex. The boat Pokémon design is one of the most visually striking and conceptually ambitious from the entire beta Pokédex. The fusion of biological and nautical elements creates a creature that exists at the boundary between nature and human technology, suggesting themes that Pokémon would not fully explore until much later with Pokémon like Klinklang or Magarna. The plesiosaur-inspired body gives it an ancient, prehistoric quality, connecting it to the same long-necked marine reptile lineage that inspired Lapras. The Viking longship features, particularly what appears to be decorative prowwork and possibly sail-like structures, overlay human cultural elements onto this natural foundation, creating a creature that might be both animal and vessel simultaneously. The practical applications of a rideable ship Pokémon would have been significant for gameplay. Generation 2 introduced several quality of life improvements over Generation 1, including Fly becoming reusable without consuming the move slot in the same way, making traversal more convenient. A ship Pokémon could have served similar purposes for water travel, perhaps allowing players to move faster across water routes or access areas that normal surf users could not reach. The design's large size, evident from the sprite proportions, suggests it could have carried multiple passengers or cargo, making it not just a mode of transportation, but a mobile platform. This would have been mechanically novel and could have opened up interesting level design possibilities, creating water routes that required specific Pokémon to traverse or areas accessible only by ship Pokémon rather than by any Pokémon knowing surf. The Viking longship connection is particularly fascinating because Vikings represent a maritime culture that successfully navigated some of the most challenging waters in the world, exploring, trading, and settling across vast distances. Viking ships were technological marvels of their time, designed with shallow drafts that allowed them to navigate both open ocean and shallow rivers, making them extraordinarily versatile. A Pokémon that embodied Viking ship principles would be similarly versatile, comfortable in deep seas and shallow waters, able to go places other water Pokémon could not. This versatility would have made it valuable for exploration-focused players, those who enjoyed discovering every corner of the game world and wanted transportation options that matched that playstyle. The mythological dimensions of sea serpents and dragons in Viking culture also enrich an understanding of this design. Vikings decorated their ships with dragon and serpent imagery, partly for aesthetic reasons, but also because these creatures held symbolic power, representing strength, protection, and the mystical dangers of the sea. The overlap between the biological plesiosaur elements and the cultural Viking ship elements in the boat Pokémon design suggests a creature that might have been revered or feared by ancient human sailors, a living ship that inspired the technology of actual ships, or perhaps a Pokémon that adapted its appearance to mimic human vessels for unknown purposes. This ambiguity about whether nature inspired culture or culture inspired nature creates compelling narrative possibilities. The theory that this boat Pokémon might have been intended as an evolution for Lapras is supported by several design similarities and contextual factors. Both are large, rideable water Pokémon with long necks and gentle dispositions implied by their appearances. Both draw on plesiosaur or similar marine reptile anatomy. Lapras in Generation 1 was already positioned as a special Pokémon, rare and valuable, associated with water traversal and with helping humans across the seas. An evolution would have enhanced these characteristics, creating an even larger, more powerful version that could serve as the ultimate water transportation. The boat elements could have been explained as Lapras, developing ship-like features as it aged and grew, perhaps mimicking the vessels it often carried, or developing natural structures that served similar functions to sails and prows. However, the Lapras evolution theory faces challenges that might explain why the boat Pokémon was cut, even if it was originally conceived for this purpose. Lapras is a beloved Pokémon with a strong existing identity, and evolution could have altered that identity in unwelcome ways. Part of Lapras's appeal is its gentle, nurturing character, being a Pokémon that helps transport people safely across dangerous waters. An evolution might have made it appear more aggressive or imposing, especially with the Viking warship elements, potentially changing the emotional register from gentle helper to powerful vessel. Game Freak might have decided that Lapras was better served by remaining a single-stage Pokémon, preserving its unique position rather than giving it an evolution that could overshadow the original form. The alternative interpretation, that the boat Pokémon was its own species, entirely separate from Lapras, opens different possibilities. It could have been a legendary or mythical Pokémon, the only member of its species, representing ancient maritime mythology made manifest. It could have been a common species that lived in specific ocean regions, herds of ship Pokémon migrating across the seas like ancient vessels. It could have had a pre-evolution, a smaller boat-like creature that grew into the full Viking ship form. Each possibility would have required different implementation approaches and would have fit into different niches within the Pokédex. The fact that Game Freak ultimately decided not to pursue any of these options suggests that none of them worked satisfactorily within the constraints and priorities of Generation 2's development. The removal of the boat Pokémon also relates to the broader question of how explicitly mechanical or human-made elements should appear in Pokémon designs. Generation 1 had already established that some Pokémon could appear artificial, with Magnemite and Voltorb looking like human technology despite being living creatures. Generation 2 would continue this tradition with Pokémon like Forretress, which resembles a man-made fortification despite being a bug Pokémon's natural defensive adaptation. The boat Pokémon pushed further in this direction, not just looking like human technology, but potentially being indistinguishable from actual Viking ships in some contexts. This might have felt like too much, crossing from resembles human technology into is indistinguishable from human technology, creating philosophical questions about what qualifies as a Pokémon versus what is simply a vehicle or tool. Later generations would explore this boundary more boldly with Pokémon like Klefki or Vanillite, but Generation 2 might have been too early in the series' history for such explicit human object Pokémon. The artistic execution of the boat Pokémon design, based on the beta sprites available, shows a high level of detail and careful consideration of how biological and mechanical elements integrate. The dragon-like head serves as both the creature's actual head and as the decorative prow of the ship. The body curves in ways that suggest both a living spine and the curved keel of a wooden vessel. The tail might have functioned as both a biological appendage for swimming and as a rudder for steering. This seamless integration of dual functions demonstrates sophisticated design thinking, creating a creature that is convincingly both organism and object. The execution quality makes the design's exclusion all the more notable, as this was clearly not a rough sketch that was cut for being underdeveloped, but rather a polished concept that was cut despite being well realized. The environmental implications of where this boat Pokemon would have been encountered also factor into understanding its exclusion. Large, powerful water Pokemon generally appear late in games, in areas accessible only after players have made substantial progress through the story. Lapras in Generation 1 appeared in Silph as a gift Pokemon, making it accessible but rare. Gyarados required evolving from the easily obtained but weak Magikarp. Blastoise was a starter evolution, guaranteed to players who chose Squirtle. Each strong water Pokemon had a carefully controlled acquisition method that balanced its power with its availability. The boat Pokemon, if it was as strong as its size suggests, would have needed a similar controlled acquisition. Perhaps it was meant to be a gift Pokemon from an NPC, a one-time encounter in a special location, or a prize for completing a side quest. Implementing any of these methods would have required development resources, NPC dialogue, potentially new areas or events, and all of this infrastructure for a single Pokemon might not have been justifiable when resources were limited. The possibility that this ship Pokemon was an intended Lapras evolution opens interesting questions about how Game Freak viewed evolutionary lines for older Pokemon. Generation 2 introduced several new evolutions and pre-evolutions for Generation 1 species, including Crobat, Politoed, Slowking, Steelix, and others. The beta data suggests that even more of these cross-generation evolutions were planned initially. A Lapras evolution would have made sense thematically, giving the gentle transport Pokemon a larger, more powerful form that could cross oceans or serve as a mobile base for trainers. However, Lapras's status as a rare and special Pokemon might have discouraged Game Freak from adding an evolution, as doing so could have diminished its uniqueness. As we drift a little deeper tonight, the various regional bird Pokemon concepts from the beta show Game Freak experimenting with different approaches to filling ecological niches. Every Pokemon generation includes early game bird species that players can catch near the beginning of their journey, typically following a 3-stage evolutionary line and learning flying-type moves to facilitate travel. The beta version of Generation 2 contained multiple bird designs that competed for this role, including some that looked quite different from the Hoothoot and Noctowl line that eventually became the primary early bird option. One cut bird design appeared to be based on a stork or heron with long legs and a distinctive beak. Another resembled a generic songbird with bright plumage. A third looked more aggressive and predatory, possibly inspired by hawks or eagles. Each of these designs could have served as the regional bird, but Game Freak ultimately chose to focus on owls, with Hoothoot and Noctowl, providing a nocturnal alternative to the daytime birds that had been featured prominently in Generation 1. This choice reinforced Generation 2's themes of time and day-night cycles, making the owl design a more thematically appropriate selection than any of the cut alternatives. The decision to cut multiple bird designs while keeping only one evolutionary line demonstrates how Game Freak thought about Pokédex composition. Rather than including every bird concept they had sketched, they selected the single bird line that best represented their vision for the region and cut the rest. This approach prevented the Pokédex from feeling repetitive or oversaturated with similar species. It also meant that each Pokémon that did make it into the final game had a clear purpose and identity within the ecosystem, rather than competing with multiple similar designs for the player's attention. Before we continue, another design worth exploring is a peculiar skeleton Pokémon that appeared late in the beta Pokédex. This design showed a complete skeletal creature, Not just a skull or partial bones like Cubone wears, but a full living skeleton as a usable Pokémon. While the series had featured skeletal remains in locations like the Pokémon Museum and had ghost types that referenced death and spirits, a literal walking skeleton as a catchable Pokémon pushed the boundaries of what Game Freak was willing to include in their family friendly monster collecting game. The design also bore some resemblance to xenomorphs from the Alien film franchise, adding another layer of potential concern about appropriateness. The skeleton Pokemon's exclusion likely came down to the same concerns that removed Norara and Chopin, the curse-themed Pokemon with needles stuck into their bodies. While darker themes could be hinted at through text and subtle design elements, explicit imagery of death or body horror was deemed too intense for the target audience. This self-imposed limitation has shaped which Pokemon concepts get approved throughout the series' history. Ghost types are allowed because they can be portrayed playfully, with cute or mysterious designs that suggest supernatural elements without being genuinely frightening. A realistic skeleton, on the other hand, crossed into territory that was difficult to present in a light-hearted manner. Slowly, the story widens to include the many fish and aquatic Pokémon that were designed for Generation 2 but never implemented. The Johto region includes several bodies of water and aquatic routes, and the beta data reveals that Game Freak planned an even more diverse underwater ecosystem than what appeared in the final game. Multiple fish designs were cut, including some that seemed to be based on flying fish, others inspired by deep-sea creatures, and at least one that resembled a cherry salmon or similar freshwater species. Each of these aquatic Pokémon would have added depth and variety to water-based encounters, but they were ultimately deemed redundant or lower priority compared to other designs. The challenge of creating distinctive fish Pokémon is deceptively difficult. The natural world contains thousands of fish species, from tiny minnows to massive ocean sunfish, from streamlined predators like barracuda to elaborate ornamental species like seahorses and pipefish. This abundance provides endless inspiration, but it also means that fish designs can easily blur together if they are not given strong distinguishing characteristics beyond simply looking like different types of real-world fish. A successful fish Pokémon needs to capture something essential about the fish that inspired it, while also translating that essence into Pokémon's stylized aesthetic and giving the creature an identity that extends beyond its biological inspiration. Goldeen and Seeking from Generation 1 established one template for fish Pokémon: elegant, simple designs that emphasize beauty and grace, with clear type specialization toward water, with no secondary type. Magikarp and Gyarados established a very different template, an evolutionary line where the weak, pathetic first form dramatically transforms into a powerful, intimidating final form, creating a rags-to-riches narrative that resonates with players. Generation 2's fish Pokémon needed to find new templates, new approaches that did not simply repeat what Generation 1 had already accomplished. Remoraid and Octillery succeeded by creating a bizarre, evolutionary disconnect, a fish that becomes an octopus, prioritizing surprise and memorable weirdness over biological logic. The cut fish designs from the beta apparently did not find equally distinctive approaches. One particularly interesting cut fish Pokémon is a design that looks similar to Cherim, despite being a completely different species. This creature had fins arranged in a way that suggested petals or flower-like structures, blending aquatic and botanical themes. The design might have inspired aspects of Cherim when that Pokémon was created for Generation 4, or it might be a case of convergent design where similar concepts emerge independently during different development cycles. Either way, the existence of this cut Pokémon demonstrates that Game Freak was thinking about unusual hybrid concepts that combined unexpected elements, like flowers and fish, to create memorable and distinctive species. The intersection of botanical and aquatic themes in a single Pokemon design creates interesting possibilities for typing, appearance, and gameplay function. Would this flowerfish be water-grass dual type, creating interesting strategic applications, but also making it vulnerable to several common attack types? Would it be pure water type, with plant-like visual features, but no mechanical grass characteristics? Would it have abilities or moves that reflected both its aquatic and botanical nature, learning both water-type attacks and grass-type moves like petal dance or synthesis? The answers to these questions would have significantly affected how players perceived and used the Pokemon, and Game Freak's inability to settle on satisfying answers might have contributed to the design's exclusion. The deep-sea fish concepts in the beta represent another unexplored direction for aquatic Pokemon design. Deep-sea environments are among the most alien and fascinating ecosystems on Earth, featuring creatures adapted to extreme pressure, total darkness, and scarce food resources. Deep-sea fish often have bizarre appearances, with bioluminescent lures, enormous mouths, transparent bodies, or other striking adaptations. A Pokemon based on deep-sea fish could have tapped into these unsettling but compelling visuals, creating water-type species that felt genuinely strange and otherworldly. However, the question of where players would encounter these deep-sea Pokemon creates gameplay challenges. Would there be specific deep ocean areas accessible only through diving or special abilities? Would they appear in certain caves with underground lakes? Without clear answers about encounter locations and contexts, implementing deep-sea Pokemon becomes difficult. The flying fish design mentioned earlier deserves additional consideration because it represents an attempt to combine two movement modes, swimming and flying, in a single creature. Real-world flying fish are remarkable animals that have evolved enlarged pectoral fins that function as wings, allowing them to glide above the water surface for considerable distances to escape predators. A Pokemon based on flying fish would logically have water-flying dual typing, creating strategic depth and making it distinct from pure water-type fish. However, Generation 2 already included Mantine as a new water-flying Pokemon, and Generation 1 had Gyarados filling a similar type combination. Adding another water-flying fish might have felt redundant, especially if its design or capabilities did not sufficiently differentiate it from existing options. The salmon-inspired design from the beta connects to both natural history and cultural traditions in ways that could have enriched Generation 2's world-building. Salmon are famous for their spawning migrations, swimming upstream against powerful currents to return to their birthplaces and reproduce. This life cycle has inspired mythology and cultural practices in many societies that depend on salmon fisheries. A salmon Pokemon could have incorporated these migratory themes into its design or capabilities, perhaps requiring specific in-game conditions to evolve, learning moves that referenced swimming upstream or overcoming obstacles, or having special interactions with certain routes or locations that represented spawning grounds. These thematic connections would have made the salmon design more than just another fish Pokemon, giving it narrative depth and integration with the game world. Its exclusion represents a missed opportunity for this type of environmental storytelling through Pokemon design. The sheer number of aquatic designs in the beta, far exceeding what could be reasonably included in the final game, suggests that Game Freak's designers found water Pokemon to be a particularly generative category for creative exploration. The diversity of aquatic life provides endless reference material, and the water type's popularity among players creates motivation to design appealing water-type options. However, this abundance became a problem during the curation process, as designers had to decide which fish and aquatic creatures were truly essential and which could be cut without diminishing the Pokédex's overall quality and diversity. The cuts were probably agonizing, removing designs that were individually appealing but collectively redundant. The ecological distribution of water Pokémon across different aquatic environments also factors into understanding which designs survived and which were cut. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you again.